to introduce then our guest speaker, Mr. Gellel, who, as I said, is the head of the Army History Unit, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you today, Tim. But may I, just as we begin, come in, Mr. Grimley and others from Miranda, great to see you. So Tim, prior to taking up the position as the head of the Australian Army History Unit in 2017, he was an Australian regular Army officer who had a 30-year career, including deployments to Afghanistan and Kuwait in support of Australian Special Operations Task Groups, and also postings as the commanding officer of the Australian Defence Force School of Languages, of which he is a graduate, and as a Defence Attaché and student in Japan. As I mentioned that, you might imagine some of the insights that he's going to be sharing with us shortly. He holds a Master of Arts International Relations from Deakin University and is a graduate of the Australian Defence Force School of Languages, as I said, the Japan Ground Self-Defence Force Command and General Staff course, and the Japan National Institute for Defence Studies. Tim is the author of several articles. You may have read him in Wartime just recently, and he has presented on Australian and Japanese military history and currently completing a manuscript focused on the Battle of Milne Bay. So we'll have a special insight today from some of that which will appear in the book. As I said, he will consider for us how Milne Bay was so vital to Japanese plans to seize Port Moresby and to isolate Australia. And I'd like you to join with me in welcoming Tim Gellel as our guest speaker today.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for providing me with this opportunity to address the Battle for Australia Association of New South Wales on the Battle of Milne Bay. It's been an issue that's taken up a lot of my interest over about the last 5 or 6 years. Today I propose to provide an overview of the battle and then to examine some key matters that have perhaps not been particularly well documented elsewhere. I do need to put a bit of a rider out there, and that is to say that the presentation is based upon personal research that I've conducted in Australia, in Japan and at Milne Bay, and that was all prior to my appointment in October last year when I joined the Australian Army History Unit. I like to say that for the last 20 years I've been a serial pest at the Australian Army History Unit. They finally relented and let me in. While I'm confident of my research, I am speaking from a very personal perspective, and my views do not necessarily represent those of the Australian Army, the Department of Defence or the Australian Government. And you might say, well, why is he saying that? And that is to say that the book is not complete, the manuscript is out for comment, and it does present some new information which is different to what you will find in the official history that was produced in the 1960s. So if I apply hindsight, please forgive me, I'm not trying to diminish the achievement of the Australian and the American servicemen who were at Milne Bay. Today's researcher has access to Japanese records, including the post-battle report. The Japanese wanted to know why they lost. So they interrogated. I don't think it would be really true, having read the descriptions to say interviewed, they more or less interrogated the survivors and said, what happened? How did this happen? And that report is actually available on the internet, but it's kind of hidden. It's a bit hard to find. So today's researcher has access to that sort of record. We have access to records and diaries that are at the Australian War Memorial, and some of those have been used previously. We also have access to published memoirs from Japan. I say we, it helps if you read Japanese. It helps if the government spend a lot of money teaching you to read Japanese. So I actually see this as a bit of an affirmation, it's a bit of a return, I hope, on the investment that the Commonwealth has put in my education. The key thing is that information allows me to see things that people on the ground in 1942, 1945, the 50s and 60s I have access to information that I could only have dreamed of. So if I'm applying hindsight, it's because I have had the benefit of that education and I have had the benefit of the access to the material that people just could not have had, particularly while the battle was actually occurring. And I should stress too that the Allied victory at Milne Bay was not inevitable. I've used the term the tide turned, but that's not to say it's passive. It's not to say it's some natural event. where it was just going to happen one day that the Japanese advance would stop. That's not the case. It's actually a quote, or it's a manipulation of a quote, which I'll talk about later on, from one of the participants of the battle. But also, I absolutely adore this photograph. I'm told you shouldn't use photographs that don't have faces of people in it. Of course, everyone's facing away from the camera. But this photograph represents to me the high tide mark of the Japanese advance. And nothing speaks to the nature of the Battle of Milne Bay, to my mind, as much as this photograph. You can see the Japanese tanks, you can see where they have stopped. You can see that they are bombed. You can see that there is mud, and you can see the Australians advancing past them. And when I say Australians, I said Allied victory. I also have to stress that this was as much a US victory as it was an Australian victory. Australians provided most of the combatants, but a key component, of course, in this battle is the application of air power, and that was only possible because the airfields had been built by US engineers. The Australians did not have the capacity, particularly the heavy machinery, to clear 2-kilometre long, 170-metre wide strips through the jungle. Couldn't have been done in the time available without the presence of US engineers. Without those engineers, the airfields wouldn't have been built. Without the airfields, the Royal Australian Air Force wouldn't have been there. Without the Royal Australian Air Force, I'm pretty confident the battle wouldn't have been won. Now, I should also say, my background as an Army officer, now working with Australian Army history in it. If there's a heavy Army focus on this, I think you'll probably forgive me. Please, I want to acknowledge up front, particularly the Air Force contribution, but I do have a slide to talk about the Navy as well. You can't go to a military history presentation without someone talking about Napoleon. This is no exception. So Napoleon once said that in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So it's with these caveats in mind, I'd like to speak about the Battle of Milne Bay, how it unfolded, and how the Allied victory there shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Alright, it's going to be my test of technology. By August 1942, Japanese forces had been in New Guinea for about 5 months. After capturing Rabaul, Kavieng in January, and then Lae and nearby Salinara in March, Port Moresby was identified as the next joint objective. But US Navy aircraft carrier raids confirmed the Japanese Army's fears about the vulnerability of conducting an amphibious operation against Port Moresby. So the landing was postponed until such time as Japanese aircraft carriers could be made available to protect the Japanese invasion convoy. The invasion of Port Moresby plan considered 3 options. The China Strait offered the shortest route, but transits would be vulnerable to attack while navigating these narrow waters. And what I should say too, because there is a Navy officer in the room, is Army officers always think in maps, and we think that all that blue area out there is navigable. I'm going to do a terrible thing, I'm going to point at the map. It's a series of reefs that come out this way. They come out all the way to this group of islands out here. It's called the Louisiade Archipelago. And to an Army officer, we just expect, we expect the Navy just to be able to use all that area. In fact, there's only 3 passageways, and this is the first of them. This is the one that's closest. The second option that was considered was to sail all the way around the east of the Louisiade Archipelago. But that would double the amount of time that the Japanese invasion convoy would be vulnerable to Allied air attack from bases in northern Australia. I'm thinking Cooktown and Townsville in particular. So this left the central route, the Jomard Passage, as the best route. As the convoy would be exposed in the Coral Sea for about 12 hours, success would rely upon securing local air and sea superiority. So the Japanese planned that 2 of their aircraft carriers would sweep around the Solomon Islands to protect their flank. When I pointed the map again, the aircraft carriers were meant to be coming around this way. But the Japanese didn't expect that 2 US Navy aircraft carriers would be present They had been forewarned by signals intelligence. Over the course of 5 days, the Battle of the Coral Sea took place. Heavy aircraft losses forced the Japanese aircraft carriers to withdraw, and the planned Port Moresby landing was again postponed. Thwarted by sea, the Japanese army planned to take Port Moresby overland via the Kokoda Trail. And they would do this by establishing a beachhead at Milne. Logistics would be their biggest challenge. Anything that could not be carried by man would have to be brought to Port Moresby by sea. And that meant securing the China Strait was critical to the success of the Kokoda operation. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy landed small forces in the Central Solomons and commenced building an airfield on Gellel Island. So if the Japanese had recognised the importance of China Strait, so had the Allies. The newly appointed Supreme Commander Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, directed his staff to find a suitable location for an airfield which he would then use to support an offensive to retake Rabaul. They settled on Milne Bay at New Guinea's eastern tip. In MacArthur's words, with Milne Bay in Australian hands, the east flank of Port Moresby would be secure. At Rabaul, orders from Tokyo had been received, and they called for a combined Japanese Army and Navy landing near Port Moresby to support the advance over the Kokoda Trail. For that landing, the Japanese Navy would need to secure the China Strait. Japanese air reconnaissance had, by late May, identified Milne Bay as the site where they would like to establish an airfield. But as a first step, the Japanese Navy planned to establish a seaplane base at a place called Samurai Island, not Samurai, Samurai, it's a Papuan word. I should have asked him, I've been to Milne Bay, I think there's a couple. Yep, fantastic. I don't know if you've ever got to the China Strait. I haven't been to Samurai, but apparently it's a very picturesque little island. So they were going to establish a seaplane base there to provide some local air cover while their ships went through that very narrow China Strait. But for the Japanese, the presence of the Allied garrison at Milne Bay was completely unknown until the 4th of August, when a Japanese aerial reconnaissance flight reported 30 Allied aircraft were there at an airfield they hadn't seen before. Meanwhile, the Japanese army was beginning to recognise its limits. Units that were going to advance over the Kokoda Trail had been stripped back to the bare minimum. This was to try and make the crossing over the Kokoda Trail easier for the troops who had to carry everything with them. But without a secure sea route to resupply them if they reached Port Moresby, it would not be possible to bring vehicles and fuel and ammunition that they would need to establish an airbase there in Port Moresby. So without Samurai Island, without China Strait, and therefore without Milne Bay, the Japanese army advance over the Owen Stanleys would ultimately be meaningless. The Navy planned to suppress the Allied airbase at Milne Bay using bombers, and they planned their airstrike for the 7th of August. But that morning, US Marines, and I know we have one here with us today, US Marines landed at Guadalcanal Island in the Solomons, and that forced the Japanese to redirect their bombers to the east rather than towards Milne Bay. At the same time, as the Japanese army continued to advance over the Kokoda Trail, that put pressure on the Japanese Navy. Every step the Japanese army took closer to Port Moresby made the Navy's mission, the Japanese Navy's mission of securing China Strait, more important. So on the 12th of August, the Japanese Navy issued orders for the capture of Milne Bay. So at around 36 kilometres long and some 11 kilometres wide, Milne Bay is a fine natural harbour. It's ringed by high mountains, and fast-flowing creeks and rivers empty the region's annual 2.5 metre rainfall into the bay. In good weather, the narrow government track that ringed the bay's western end was trafficable. But torrential rains throughout August had left it all but impassable to four-wheel drive vehicles. Even tracked Bren gun carriers became hopelessly bogged. knee-deep mud exhausted marching troops and sucked their boots from their feet. At the bay's western end, US and Australian engineers commenced construction of 3 airfields. That started in June. When Brigadier John Field's 7th Brigade arrived, these men too were put onto labouring tasks. That undermined their ability to prepare defences and train in the unfamiliar environment. I'd just like to dwell on the 7th Brigade for a moment. It had 3 battalions. It was comprised of militiamen who would probably be aware under the Service Act at the time were liable for service in Australian territory, and Papua was considered Australian territory at the time. Those 3 battalions, as eventually habitable Queensland battalions, the 9th, the 25th and the 61st. The 61st had associations through its pre-war militia days and affiliations with the Scottish regiment that was known as the Cameron Highlanders. On the 21st of July, Number 1 strip was declared ready. And within days, the Royal Australian Air Force Number 75 and Number 76 squadrons, which were equipped with P-40 Kittyhawks, had arrived. And they were joined by a handful of Hudson bombers from Number 6 and Number 32 squadrons. Mid-August, Brigadier George Wooden's 18th Brigade arrived, and they were AIF troops that come from the Middle East. 3 battalions there, the 2nd 9th, Queenslanders, 2nd 10th, which was South Australians primarily, 2nd 12th, which is Tasmanians, rounded out with a few Queenslanders, so an awful lot of Queenslanders in this battle. On the 22nd of August, Major General Cyril Clowes, and there is a debate whether it's Clowes or Close, and we've gone as far as looking up everyone in the Defence Force telephone directory who's got that name and saying, hello. And so far we're 50-50 Close and Clowes. I stand to be corrected if anyone remembers General Clowes. He was a cautious and reserved 50-year-old, and his nickname was Silent Cyril. He assumed command of all of Milne Force. His plan was to use Brigadier General Field's less experienced 7th Brigade as the forward brigade, and that would be tasked with defending the bay. Meanwhile, Brigadier Wooden's 18th Brigade would be the rear brigade, and that would be tasked with countering any Japanese attack. So what I've got there is to the left, the 18th Brigade, as a, more or less the location of all 3 battalions. There were some sub-elements spread across to the north. But you'll see out to the right the individual battalions of the militia 7th Brigade indicated there as the 25th, the 9th and the 61st. They're the main positions. Alright, now it's time to talk about Japanese plans. So the Japanese commanded this operation as naval officer. All the forces, air, sea and ground in this operation for the Japanese side are from the Japanese Navy. There's no Japanese army troops in this battle whatsoever. Hands up if you've accidentally made that mistake when you wrote an article in your time about 10 years ago. So the Japanese commander was naval officer, was Commander Hayashi, and his orders were to land near Rabi on the night of the 25th, 26th August and seize the airfield. So he's coming in from the east, from the south, into the bay itself and landing on the northern coast of the bay. He had 612 men with him, and they were organised into his headquarters and 2 naval infantry companies. They were supported by 2 light tanks. Also accompanying him were 228 men who operated landing craft, so a naval logistics unit, and 362 mostly unarmed Korean and Taiwanese labourers. Hayashi would also be supported by Commander Tsukioka's 350 men, and they were to move by landing craft from Buna to Taupota and cross the Stirling Range to outflank the Australian defences from the north. So this shows Tsukioka's planned route. He's meant to do it over 3 days in open-top landing craft, resting up overnight on the shore, and come in and attack basically to outflank the Australians, as I said. But on the afternoon of the 24th of August, coast watchers, naval coast watchers, Royal Australian naval officers, spotted Tsukioka's force near Porlock Harbour. The next day, 9 Number 75 Squadron Kittyhawks attacked. They attacked Tsukioka's landing craft where they had stopped to make lunch on Goodenough Island. As a result of that attack, all 7 barges were left blazing, and a column of smoke rising 1,000 feet into the air could be seen by the Australian pilots. Unfortunately for Commander Hayashi, he was unaware that Tsukioka's men were now stranded on Goodenough Island and would not be able to join him in the battle. This is a... that's interesting. I don't know where Amy is. So we'll just go and close and see what happens there. There we go. Alright. Okay, so Commander Hayashi's force entered Milne Bay a few hours before midnight on the 25th. Heavy cloud and sea mist made it difficult to identify the intended landing point. Not long after landing, the Japanese chased down 2 small boats. These boats were withdrawing D Company from the 71st Battalion from their outpost at Ayama. I know it says Ahiyama, but apparently it's pronounced Ayama. One of those boats, the lugger Bronzewing, was forced aground and 3 Australians were captured. Australian prisoners were interrogated, and they told the Japanese that the airstrip was protected by around 1,500 troops, and reinforcements had arrived only a week earlier. This is the second bit of bad luck for the Japanese. First one is Tsukioka gets stranded, can't join them from the north. The second one is, so when you go through the details of Japanese planning, they actually never identified the size of the Australian garrison. So if you don't know what you're up against, then you know if you've got enough troops to actually fight the battle. There was some more bad news for the Japanese. The quartermaster came ashore. He was met by a junior officer who apologised and said to him, "It seems we've landed on the wrong beach." The Japanese ships had actually pulled up more than 10 kilometres short of their intended objective. Hayashi decided to push on towards the airfield regardless, and he hoped to seize it before sunrise. I'm going the wrong way now, aren't I? There we go. After marching 4 kilometres, his column contacted Lieutenant Bird Robinson's 14-man standing patrol at Cameron Springs. The Australian sentry, Private Wally Whitman, was shot as he challenged Japanese figures in the darkness. In response, Robinson's men opened up, killing 4 Japanese and wounding a further 15. Robinson then conducted a fighting withdrawal back towards B Company's main position at a place called KB Mission. Even with support from his tanks, Hayashi found the Australian line a tough nut to crack. In a series of engagements, he forced the Australians back to a position along the Yako-Ekonai Creek by around about 0500 hours that morning. As daylight approached, Commander Hayashi sent 2 situation reports back to Rabaul, and he apologised for not capturing the airfield. That change in plan forced other changes in the Japanese plan. Unloading operations of the transport ships was suspended around about 30 minutes before sunrise. And that was to allow the Japanese transport ships enough time to depart the bay in darkness. As they left, the ships were attacked by 8 US B-17 bombers. None of the Japanese ships were seriously damaged, but more bombers arrived and dropped their loads on the Japanese beachhead. However, it was the Royal Australian Air Force fighters that did most of the damage that unhinged Japanese planes. A series of Kitty Hawk strikes throughout the morning sank or set afire all 12 Japanese landing craft. First to be hit were 2 landing craft that were carrying 250 kilogram bombs. Remember, the Japanese wanted to set up an air base here, so they're carrying aircraft bombs. Those bombs cooked off, and they set fire to aviation fuel that was being carried in other landing craft, creating a veritable sea of fire. Number 75 Squadron alone undertook 39 sorties that day. So 39 attacks with probably around about 14 or maybe 12 operational aircraft, so flying multiple sorties. Number 76 Squadron maintained a similar strike rate and expended a total of approximately 35,000 rounds of 50 calibre ammunition. Often these sorties were conducted so quickly that the Kitty Hawk's gun barrels were still emitting wisps of smoke as they landed back at number 1 Street. Japanese tried unsuccessfully to push forward during breaks in the air attacks. Opposite them was B Company led by Captain Biggs. They occupied defensive positions along the Ekonai Creek. As the morning wore on, it seemed likely the Japanese had withdrawn, so an Australian patrol was dispatched to investigate. They advanced a few hundred metres to a position near the Wadu Wadu Creek before they were repulsed. Despite this setback, Captain Biggs was ordered to push on, just in case enemy reinforcements arrived that night. By now, Biggs had been reinforced with 2 more companies from the 61st Battalion and 1 company from the 25th Battalion. It gave him a total of 4 companies. That's normally a Lieutenant Colonel's responsibility, not captains. Biggs was a newly promoted captain, but he would prove to be a commensurate combat leader. In the late afternoon, the Australian artillery fired 140 high explosive rounds in an 8-minute barrage. 15 minutes later, airstrikes dropped anti-personnel bombs 300 yards in front of Biggs' line. They were followed by 7 Kitty Hawks conducting strafing runs. And advancing astride the gunner track, Biggs intended to reach the high ground of the Cameron Plateau that overlooked Milne Bay and Cape Mission. His men crossed the Ekonai Creek in the heavy rain, and although they advanced around about 800 yards, they could not press the attack any further. So he's aiming for this area up here in the Cameron Plateau. Maps are deceptive. You really can't move, for those who have been at Milne Bay, more than a few metres, maybe about 100 metres off the coastline before you just get into thick vegetation. You can't walk through, you can't conduct operations. The Australians now come up against the Japanese defensive line, and with darkness approaching, Biggs broke off the attack and withdrew to the Motio Creek. This counterattack had proved too ambitious, but the Australians now knew they were facing a strong force. Nevertheless, the militia soldiers had proved they did not lack aggression, and their attack contributed to Hayashi's caution that night. From the air attacks during the day, Hayashi knew that the airfield remained operational. His men were tired and had suffered many casualties. Half of his platoon commanders by this stage were killed or wounded. Further adding to his concerns, Hayashi was informed that all his supplies had been destroyed in the air raids at the beachhead, and he had not received any word from Commander Tsukioka. But if they had landed, as had been planned, he was obliged to continue his attacks. In his favour, Commander Hayashi could rely upon his 2 tanks, and this is one of them restored at the War Memorial. We're looking at the back end of it here, but it's probably one of the best colour shots that's available. And he also had some flamethrowers, and he could also use the cover of darkness to protect his troops from observation and attack by Allied aircraft. The attack did not proceed as Hayashi had wished. He pressed some Papuans into service to act as guides, but they led him down an inland route. His men struggled on through the thick vegetation for 6 hours. When they rejoined the road, they found they hadn't advanced more than 1 kilometre from their start point. Frustrated, he cancelled the night's attack. But as often happens, 2 of his platoons didn't get the order, and they continued to advance along the coast. I swear I didn't do anything. So 2 of his platoons didn't get the order, and at around about 2200 hours they fell on the Australian main line, which was held by the main strength of the 61st Battalion, still under Captain Biggs' command. Biggs was determined to conduct an active defence. He deployed one of his companies across the creek to meet the advancing Japanese. The Japanese attacks continued, and although the tanks were not participating in this aspect of the battle, one of the flamethrowers came into action. Now, if you can imagine, Milne Bay is pitch black at night, and when somebody uses a flamethrower, everyone on the battlefield sees it. The Japanese flamethrower elicited from the Australians a ferocious response. And it was quickly silenced with a shower of hand grenades. But Australian casualties began to mount, and at around 0400 hours, the Japanese sailors started to work around the flanks, including wading out into the bay to try and get around the Australian position. Biggs decided to pull back to the next river. A patrol dispatched to cover his withdrawal reported the Japanese had also withdrawn. But for 2 nights, Captain Biggs' aggressive employment of the militia companies had frustrated the Japanese advance. When the 3 companies from the 61st Battalion returned to the unit lines, their combined strength of soldiers who were ready for combat totaled only 82 men. They probably started with just over 200, quite on the strength, but they probably started with over 200. Most of them were dead, they were wounded, they were exhausted, they hadn't eaten, they were suffering in some cases from malaria, some had become lost in the darkness as well. As the first units to engage the Japanese landing forces, the militiamen had proven their mettle, despite being undertrained and facing an enemy that was at least equal in number, but was equipped with tanks and with flamethrowers. These Queenslanders had lived up to the 61st Battalion's boast. Cameron never yields. The next morning was the 27th, and some Japanese aircraft arrived over the Battle over Milne Bay for the first time for a matter of days. This included 7 Zero fighters and 8 Bell dive bombers. Their air raid turned out to be a disaster for the Japanese airmen. They lost 2 dive bombers and 4 fighters. The losses were not entirely one-sided. Number 76 Squadron lost its commander that day, Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull. He had dived to attack Japanese troops on the ground when his aircraft suddenly flipped over onto its back and crashed. Before taking off, Turnbull had prophetically quipped to one of his men, "Well, boys, if I don't come back, tell my mum my last words were stuff the airborne." Command of number 76 Squadron then passed to Squadron Leader Louis Truscott. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a footballer. There you have. Quite a famous figure in the Air Force. And much loved by the Army too, actually. Meanwhile, below them, the 2nd 10th Battalion, this is now 8th Battalion, was advancing to relieve the 61st Battalion. Much was expected from these veterans. They were veterans of the Tobruk siege. However, the newly arrived 2nd 10th had not acclimatised to the environment, and they had not adapted to the needs of jungle warfare. Several factors shaped what happened next. First of all, the AIF veterans were dismissive of the militiamen. That meant in turn they were underestimating the Japanese. Second factor was that planning for the 2nd 10th Battalion's advance was confused and ignored the reality of the terrain. Third, a decision was made to lighten the men's loads so they could move through the thick vegetation. And that meant leaving most of their heavy weapons, including their Bren guns, behind. And in a decision that was much later regretted, the anti-tank weapons, including anti-tank rifles, and these were 14 kilograms of 32, 34 pound weapons, boys anti-tank rifles were left behind. And in their place they took Gellel bombs called sticky bombs. The name sticky is important. The 2nd 10th Battalion advanced to KB missions shortly before sunset and organised a hasty defence. Contact came at 19:30 hours as Hayashi's 2 tanks manoeuvred without headlights on the perimeter. Over the next 3 hours, the tanks drove a wedge into the Australians' defences. The Australians counter-attacked with one of the 3-inch mortars they'd taken with them, and they claimed to hit on the tank, but the tank didn't stop. To make matters worse, the sticky bombs didn't. They malfunctioned, or they simply bounced off the tanks. At 21:30 hours, a tank overran the C Company, and battalion headquarters came under fire. The commanding officer faced the inevitable and ordered the battalion to withdraw. By around 2:15 hours, 60 Australians had formed a thin line at a river behind KB mission called the Gama River. There was a narrow ford there. And they had with them one anti-tank rifle which had been brought up. When the Japanese tanks appeared around about 2:30 in the morning, Corporal John O'Brien used the anti-tank rifle to fire 3 rounds at around about 15 yards range. It's pretty close. I don't like being within 15 yards of a tank. And what we can say from the Japanese record is that, and what O'Brien didn't realise at the time, because he was certainly interviewed afterwards, he thought he missed the tanks. How can you miss a tank at 15 yards? Well, it's pitch black, absolute pitch black. What he didn't realise was he actually shot. I believe he shot Seaman Tanabe, who was the driver of the lead tank. The Japanese records indicate Seaman Tanabe died at that point. The Japanese can't ascribe it to a particular weapon, but one of the aspects of the fighting in the darkness was the Japanese tanks have a very big hatch in the front, around about this big. They also have a thin vision slit, so they can close that hatch and they can see through the slim vision slit. But in the darkness, my guess is they probably had that big driver's hatch open so they could see where it's going. So I have no doubt that that's something we have learned from the Japanese record, that O'Brien probably actually shot the driver. And this was to have some catastrophic effects for the Japanese later on. Nevertheless, the Japanese pushed on. They pushed the Australians off the opposite bank, and in the space of 7 hours, that veteran battalion, the 2nd 10th Battalion, had been forced out of the fight. And I don't think anyone expected that. And that was really quite a shock to General Clouds and the staff. As the Japanese continued around the bay, they faced the first of 6 platoons from the 25th Battalion, which had deployed along the bay, along the track, behind the 2nd 10th. Unknown to the Australians, Commander Hayashi's tanks had bogged down. When they bogged down...
I can't help myself, sorry. I'm an information wolf.
If you go back to that photograph, of the two tanks positioned like this, the driver of the lead tank had been killed. That happened at Vigama River. The point where the two tanks get bogged is 200 metres past the Vigama River. And so what happened here was the driver of the lead tank gets killed. Very narrow track, you might recall from the photograph. One tank can't overtake the other tank. So you're stuck in that formation. You go up to another sailor and they say, "You're now the driver of the lead tank." Thanks. He goes about 200 metres, and in the darkness, so you can imagine the pressure on him, in the darkness, he veers off to the right. And when he veers off to the right, the tank bellies out, the tracks are running in the air, digging the tank deeper into the mud. The tank coming behind him doesn't want to crash into him, knows there's a problem to the right, so what does he do? He drives to the left. If I'm going to apply hindsight, it's going to be here. What he might have done was stop his tank. He veered off to the left, the two tanks become blocked, but the Australians do not know this. So as far as they're concerned, all the Australians still further to the west are... I better get the right file. Second. Thank you. It looks like a fast forward. So this is the Gama River. This is where O'Brien fires at the tanks. They get 200 further metres. That's the end result. You can see there how one tank has tried to avoid the other. They're both gone off on opposite sides of the road. You can imagine what that was like in complete darkness. As I said, Australians don't know this is happening. Without the tank's shock value, Hayashi's advance starts to lose momentum. As the Japanese soldiers continue around the bay, they reach a place called Kilabo. There we go. And they're finally stopped at a position near the still incomplete number 3 airstrip. And there they're finally stopped by 2 sergeants, Sergeant Stan Steele and Geoffrey Ludlow. And you'll be pleased to hear too, the Regimental Sergeant Major Ken Barnett. Ken had actually, earlier in the day, he travelled up here with his pistol, encouraging his troops. When he came back to this position with Sergeant Ludlow and Steele, about 30 other Australian soldiers, who again had no reason to expect that they could stop the Japanese advance, who had believed that tanks were coming towards them. These are militiamen from the 25th Battalion, who understood that the 2nd 10th Battalion had collapsed and basically disintegrated and fallen apart as a, not that the men had panicked, but as a combat unit had lost its cohesion and in the darkness could not reform and concentrate its strength to stop the Japanese. So imagine 32 rather scared militiamen under the command of 2 sergeants that didn't have officers as their platoon commanders. The RSM was there. And there is a story that the RSM might have been threatening the Australians with his pistol as much as he was threatening the Japanese. They hold off the Japanese for a matter of hours just before sunrise, and with sunrise the Japanese go back into the pattern they've established of hiding back in the door, falling back into the jungle to avoid air attacks. The two sergeants both later received military medals. RSM is doing what an RSM is expected to do. He doesn't receive a military medal, he gets an mention in his dispatches. Okay. Let's go to our way too. Okay, so this then takes us to really one of the climaxes of the whole battle, and this is the fight for number 3 strip. On the night of 29 to 30 August, reinforcements had landed. These were 576 men, Japanese reinforcements under Commander Yano, reinforced by another 200 men under Sub-Lieutenant Yoshioka. So the Japanese are throwing in naval troops from different units by this stage. Commander Yano and Commander Hayashi are both at the same level, so Hayashi's been there for a few days, Commander Yano's both arrived. They're actually classmates from the Naval Academy, and they're having a bit of a discussion about who's in charge. Eventually they agree that they should resume the attack, but they won't resume the attack that night of 29-30 August. They'll lay up during the day, and then they will advance against the what they believe to be the airstrip. They actually believe number 3 airstrip here, which was later named Turnbull Field after Squadron Leader Turnbull, who crashed a few days earlier. They believe this is the operational airstrip, when in fact all the Air Force fighters are over another strip about 3 or 4 kilometres away over here at number 1 strip. Japanese don't know that. I might show you a graphic later on that explains why they don't know that. Okay. So they agree they're going to attack on the night of the 30th, 31st. During the day, the Australians were not happy to be passive. His name comes up again. Captain Bix decides to lead a patrol now. I should say Bix is later awarded Distinguished Service Order for his conduct of this battle. Not bad for a temporary captain. Not bad for a man who was told he was too old to join the RAF. Not bad for a militiaman in his first battle. And I'll talk a little bit later. Not bad with a unit that's thoroughly trained as militiamen for the sort of fighting they're undertaking. As you can see, I'm confirmed in fact, Captain Bix. He takes a patrol out, and first of all he comes across a Japanese field hospital, and at the hospital are a series of Japanese bodies. I think it was about 5. I think it was 5. And each of the soldiers in this field hospital, sailors I should say, sorry, had been killed by a single shot to the heart. So that they wouldn't become a burden to the unit, they've been put to death by their own medical staff. That's pretty shocking. As Bix goes a little bit further to the east, he comes across the body of some Papuans and finds that they've been killed and quite brutally treated before they were killed. As he goes further to the east, he finds some Australian soldiers who've been captured. They too have been killed and they've too been brutally treated. So what this tells you is that here is evidence of a ruthless enemy, an enemy who would neither give nor seek quarter. At dusk, the Japanese force decided to renew its attack. This is on the 30th, 31st, and set out along the track. Hayashi's men led the way, so the sailors have been there longest lead the way, and the reinforcements follow behind them. But in the darkness and heavy rain, and I think anyone who ever writes about the Battle of Milne Bay, anyone who was there during the battle, only ever talks about the rain and the mud. That's the first enemy, whether you're on the Japanese side or whether you're on the Australian side, or the Allied side I should say. The first enemy is the rain and the mud. It was relentless. So in that darkness, the Japanese column splits, and more than half of Commander Yano's men, the reinforcements, become hopelessly lost, don't play any part in the battle that night. In their way lay number 3 strip. It's a perfect killing ground. It's a 70-metre wide landing strip. It's got a cleared perimeter that extends to the Sago swamps at the southeast end, all the way back to the vegetation of the hills at its northwestern end. The strip's western end had been bulldozed through a coconut plantation, and the debris from that coconut plantation is piled up on either side of the airstrip into just a pile of trees and soil. It's about 8 feet high. So imagine 8 foot high ramparts on either side of this 2 kilometre long, 70-metre wide airfield. Australians had also run a strip of barbed wire right down the centre of the airfield to make it a better obstacle. And 2 battalions, the 61st and the 25th, are now defending the airfield. And you notice But the 61st actually spans the airfield and has got forces on both sides. And that's because there's a ridge line just here that runs parallel to the runway. It's called Stevens Ridge, whereas this side is actually quite flat. Those two battalions had between them, even though they're in a bit of a depleted state, probably more forces than the Japanese actually were able to bring into this attack, particularly because half of the Japanese reinforcements were lost during the night. And the Australians are reinforced. They're reinforced with US engineer troops who've got half tracks with 50 calibre machine guns on them. It's also Australian Vickers machine guns. Not a very heavy weapon, not one you want to carry around with you, but perfectly suited to the defence of an airfield like this. Further thickening those defences are 3-inch mortars. Further thickening those defences are 8 to 25 pounder guns from the 2nd 5th Regiment, the 9th Battery. So Commander Hayashi leads the attack. He's been there again, fabulous name. He leads the attack. His men have trudged through the mud for about 6 or 7 kilometres in the darkness. They come up against the airfield and they come into this perfect killing ground. 3 times they try to surge across the strip. Each time they're repulsed. Hayashi and his adjutant killed the attacks along with many of their men. Commander Yano, the reinforcement commander, has one of his companies with him. And they also attack across the airstrip, only to be forced back. The other force, under Sub-Lieutenant Yoshioka, unsuccessfully attempts to outflank the Australian defences by attacking Stevens Ridge. But with the approach of dawn, bringing with it the threat of renewed air attacks, Yano abandons the attack, and not one Japanese sailor reaches the far side of the airstrip. So if I can give you, this is a different view of the airstrip. 25th Battalion, 61st Battalion, Japanese advancing from this area. This photograph's taken about a month or 2 after the battle, but I think by this stage the airstrip is largely complete. I think it's almost ready for operations. But you can see in the jungle where there's not a lot of places to actually shoot people, to see people, why it is that the Japanese have stopped here. I mentioned about the 2 sergeants in the RSM. Their fighting took place down here, and again you see there's a clearing here, and that's probably what gave them a bit more of an advantage and a little bit more confidence too. They could actually see their enemy for the first time, before their enemy were right on top of them. Okay, so confident that the Japanese landing force had been broken during the previous night attack, General Clowes resumed the offensive with a plan that was only slightly different to the 2nd and 10th Battalion's advance against KV Mission 4 days earlier. His orders were simple. The 18th Brigade will attack and destroy enemy forces on the north shore of Milne Bay. Not more than 1 infantry battalion will be committed to this task. That was a force that was no stronger than the one that had been used at KV Mission. The battalion he chose to lead this attack is the 2nd 12th Mayo 8th Battalion. And following up behind them would be a militia battalion, the 9th Battalion, to secure the road as the 2nd 12th advances. Unlike the 2nd 10th Battalion, the 2nd 12th carried some of its anti-tank rifles and all of its Bren guns, so a lesson had been learned. More importantly, they employed new tactical formations. They were employing tactics at the platoon and the company level that were better suited to fighting in the jungle. And on top of that, they've actually worked out a way to coordinate air and artillery support in the jungle that hadn't actually been perfected in the early phases of the battle. So they've got this protective umbrella sitting over the top of them. Initially, the 2nd 12th encountered very little organised resistance until D Company reached KV Mission. So D Company covers all that distance, about 4 or 5 kilometres, and gets to KV Mission. Not all of the battalion makes it that far, and about half of the 2nd 12th makes a defensive position on the Garman River. They go into camp for the night, or lager for the night, very tight perimeter, everyone's facing out, ready for the worst. And this is where the next significant action takes place. I talked about the Japanese force that had tried to outflank on Stevens Ridge. Well, during the day, they withdrew into the jungle, and just around about sunset on the 31st, they emerged from the jungle, at this point, just next to the Australian, the 2nd 12th lager here at the Garman River. This is Lieutenant Yoshioka's 200-man company. Unsuspecting that the Australians lay in wait for them, the Japanese sailors were chatting loudly as they neared the Garman River ford. Bang! The Australians initiate, impromptu ambush, a fierce firefight ensues, an intermittent and savage conflict that continued until the early hours of the morning. Again, 3 times the Japanese attacked the Australian lines, but the flanks of the Australian position are secure. They're anchored against the beach on one flank and against the river on the other. It's a bit hard to say, but around about 50 to 60% of Yoshioka's 200 men are killed that night. There's a bit of imprecision in the Japanese system. If you're seen to be killed, that's confirmed as killed, and your family will get the insurance money that you have paid out of your salary. If you haven't been seen to be killed, you're missing in action, your family don't get the insurance money. So, very different way to the way Veterans Affairs works. I prefer our system. Alright. So by now the Australians are confident they've got the Japanese on the run. And over the next 5 days, the 2nd 12th Battalion, and then followed by the 2nd 9th, pushed the Japanese back from one defensive line to another. Japanese radio communications at this time contained some contradictory messages. On the one hand, there's talk of further reinforcement. And Commander Yano, who's now the senior surviving Japanese officer on the battlefield, is told to hold on. He's told he's got to continue to hold a toehold at Milne Bay. But the other contradiction is, at the same time, the landing force, Commander Yano's men, are actually sending signals saying, we think we should be evacuated. The mission has failed, and we think we should be withdrawn. It's quite unusual for Japanese forces, particularly in 1942. And although the Japanese do put up a stubborn defence, they're pushed back about 1,000 metres each day. On the 4th of September, the 2nd 9th Battalion, that's the 2nd 12th advance, on the 4th of September, the 2nd 9th Battalion makes 3 attacks to clear the Japanese along a river known as the Whitten River. Whitten named after Private Wally Whitten, the sentry who was killed on that first night. 3 attacks are made by the Australian. In the 2nd attack, Private Stanley Cross single-handedly destroyed a Japanese machine gun position and was later awarded the military medal. And another man, Sergeant Roy Devantier, who was armed with a Thompson submachine gun, destroyed a party of 5 Japanese. He was also awarded a military medal. But in a final display of courage that day, Corporal John Jack French single-handedly attacked and defeated 3 Japanese machine gun positions before being found mortally wounded. One of the members of his battalion, Private Arthur Hinds, described how Johnny French had ordered us down, and he went in and he got the first 2 posts, machine gun posts. And for the next one he came back and he got a grenade off us, and he finished off the other one. And that was the finish. When we advanced, Johnny was dead. French was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his heroism. But despite these acts of bravery, there was no prospect of forcing the Japanese from their positions before sunset. A patrol the next morning reported the Japanese had withdrawn. At 11:30 hours, the 2nd 9th Battalion came into contact with the Japanese at the Askew River. Again, the Japanese counter-attacked. For about 5 minutes, the 2 groups beat at each other, but the fighting concluded by 1700. Darkness restored quiet to the battlefield, although the Australians saw some flares which they used for target practice. Those flares had been used to signal Japanese warships in the bay that had come to evacuate the landing force. The Japanese Navy had been told they would have to evacuate about 500 people. That's how many survivors they thought there were in the Japanese landing force. There were 931 survivors. And this is actually part of the Japanese reckoning and why they do this inquisition at the end to try and find out what went wrong. How can you lose a battle but have so many survivors? It doesn't equate in the Japanese martial code. So summing up, Milne Bay's victory reflected effective and often inspirational leadership at all levels. It also reflects a mostly deliberate and cautious approach to overcoming uncertainty to defeat a determined opponent. General Clowes had secured the Australians' first clear victory over the Japanese on land. Over the course of 12 days, 2 Australian infantry brigades and 2 RAA fighter squadrons, supported for the first time by US Army engineers, and anti-aircraft gunners, as well as US Army Air Force units operating from Port Moresby in Australia, had defeated the Japanese Navy in a land battle. It's a bit hard to get my head around that. How can you defeat a Navy in a land battle? And it was Brigadier Field, who was commanding the militia 7th Brigade. He later summed up the battle and he said, "Such was the Battle of Milne Bay, small in comparison to some of the sustained and desperate fighting which took place in the Pacific, yet of fundamental importance to the Australian strategy in its result. It was the first Australian victory on land against the Japanese invader, and brought to a halt a long series of territorial gains which the enemy had seemed to achieve with relative ease. Henceforth, the tide was destined to turn." For the Japanese, the attack on Milne Bay was a disaster. More than 300 men were killed and 300 missing. Losses amongst combat leaders were especially high, and in fact only one of 8 company commanders survived the battle. The Allies lost less than 200 dead, but not one of the 22 Australians who had been captured by the Japanese in the course of the battle survived. Many had been badly mutilated. 59 Papuans had also been killed, and in many cases had been tortured or mutilated. Because their deaths occurred in Australian territory, Justice Sir William Webb was commissioned to investigate the war crimes. We should remember the Battle of Milne Bay for 2 key reasons. First, Milne Bay represented the high tide of the Japanese advance in Papua. In the 8 months since the opening strike against Pearl Harbor, the Japanese advance had not been decisively stopped. Moreover, the desperate nature of the fighting, so close to mainland Australia, in a setting so hostile, and at the time so primitive, only heightened fears of the inevitability of further Japanese victories. Encountering the Japanese advance under such difficult circumstances, the Australians enhanced their reputation as reliable soldiers. The second point is that the Allied victory meant the Japanese Navy could not guarantee the security of the China Strait supply route. That supply route was needed for 2 things: for an amphibious landing against Port Moresby, and to resupply the Japanese forces that were coming over the Kokoda Trail. Defeat at Milne Bay frustrated both these aims and ultimately undermined the Japanese advance over the Kokoda Trail. Thus, the effects of the Battle of Milne Bay on what has become known as the Battle for Australia were both physical. They stopped the Japanese advance and they removed the opportunity to use the China Strait for resupply, physical effects, and they were also moral. They proved that Australian soldiers could fight. They could fight in Papua New Guinea, that they could beat the Japanese, that the Japanese could be beaten. And that, as I said at the beginning, was by no means inevitable and no means expected at the time. So if I may, just a few points, some points that I think that this is where it differs a little bit from some of the records of the official history. We know how many Japanese forces landed. We know how many Japanese forces landed because one of the documents they left behind was all of the nominal rolls. They were dropped by the quartermaster, who was also the paymaster. So very accurate nominal rolls. They're held at the Australian War Memorial, but they weren't translated because they just weren't important at the time. The battle was over, it was finished. They're still there, almost right at the serial number for them. But they tell us exactly how many Japanese troops landed, how many sailors landed, how many weapons they carried, what their role was. And we know they were dropped by the quartermaster because the quartermaster is one of the few Japanese officers to survive, and he writes his memoirs and he says, when the Air Force attacked me, I was crossing the creek and I dropped this little container and I had all the pay records in it. So there's an issue with the quantity of the Australian soldiers, the Japanese soldiers rather, and sailors. And one of the other points I'd like to point out was there were only 2 tanks. There was a bit of debate at the time whether there were 3 or 4. You will see some contradictory things written on memorials. The Japanese records clearly indicate there were only ever 2 tanks. And we can actually identify the crewmen of those tanks. That's how I know Stephen Tanabe was killed. I know what day he was killed. I can almost tell you where he was born. Not quite. There's an issue about the quality of the Japanese forces. They're equipped very similarly to the Japanese Army, which is part of the reason why people think the Army named it there. But they're nowhere near as well trained. It's not a Navy's core job to fight land battles. They have to do a lot of things very well, not their core role. And these naval landing forces, when we translate their title, they've been given this name Special Naval Landing Forces. And we hear Special Forces in our head, but it actually doesn't mean special, it means temporary, it means provisional. It means these forces are for a temporary land operation. They will secure a piece of territory and then they will become garrison troops. So they're not Marines. Here we go. So if I said the Japanese have a total of 8 companies and one of them's stranded with Commander Tsukioka up there on Guinea Island, the Australians have 24 infantry companies and 3 Vickers machine gun companies. Now our companies are a little bit smaller, but we try and talk like for like when we talk about capabilities rather than numbers of soldiers or sailors. Australians also had some challenges. The militia brigade was rated a D in July for the level of training, but it still was committed to the battle. It was still committed to Papua because they were the forces that were available to be sent into that area. That's a pretty big risk. The AIF battalions were rated at an A. So Captain Biggs and his troops, on this scale of A to F, are rated a D, and they're the first ones to actually stop the Japanese advance for those first 2 crucial nights of the Battle of Milne Bay. Another thing was the Australians weren't properly equipped, and they weren't properly trained. And I know that's probably said about a lot of conflicts, but some of the sort of standouts here. This is actually a scene from some stock footage or some film footage taken after the battle. This gentleman was actually doing his washing. And he said, oh, I want to be in the film, I want Mum to see I'm okay. So it wasn't normal to go sort of Rambo style, shirtless, on patrol. But you can see they're wearing shorts, you can see they've got their sleeves rolled up. About 2 weeks later, the malaria casualties for this battle just go through the roof. And quite simply, the Australians weren't used to working in a malarial environment. Japanese were also very badly affected by malaria. But, you know, if I'd been the Lieutenant Commander, I would have been thoroughly, roundly sacked, kicked, counselled and admonished by my commanding officer for putting troops in that sort of danger. But again, you can see the mud. What you can perhaps also see is they're wearing tan uniforms that stand out against the background. It's a couple of weeks later that the Australians start on the Kokoda Trail, about a week and a half later, start dyeing the uniforms green. Unfortunately, some of the army hierarchy at the time said, well, nonsense. The Japanese actually had the advantage of having green uniforms. The Australians didn't. The Australians innovated, took measures in their own hands. They dyed them green, they probably skinned them green about a week afterwards. They didn't have four-wheel drives. They didn't have heavy engineering equipment. And in fact, the bulldozer is actually quite possibly not Australian because we just didn't have many of them. Didn't have a lot of four-wheel drive vehicles. So if you've got a bulldozer getting bogged there, you can imagine what's going to happen to a 2-wheel drive truck that's got a few tons of stores on the back. Interestingly enough, there was only 1 battery of Australian artillery here because senior artillery officers went there and said you can't use artillery in the jungle. And they were kind of right for the first week, but the Australians came up with a method to get around that. And the method was, they said, there's a bay, you'll have water there. So aim for the water, drop the shells in the water, and then we'll tell you where to adjust from there. If you drop them in the water, you can't miss it. I can guarantee you won't hit our soldiers. You know, simple but brilliant. How do you guide aircraft onto a target in the jungle when you don't really have a map and you don't know where you are? We'll use the artillery, we'll drop around in the bay, we'll get the artillery where we want it, then we'll drop around with artillery smoke. Big column of smoke will rise up. Then we'll drop another one over here, 2 columns of smoke. Pilots, line up those columns of smoke. That's your strafing line, that's your bombing line. Simple, crude, innovation, effective. Alright. As I said, there were only 2 Japanese tanks. Notice this picture, the tank's still got its main armors. That actually dates the photograph. This is very shortly after the Australians had first discovered, about 2 days after the tanks had been bogged, they finally found the tanks. It's the Australians who actually removed this gun, and they need to remove the gun because the They don't want the Japanese to take the tank back. They actually sabotaged the tank with some gelling. But they removed the 37mm gun, and that's actually about a full-day operation for the Grenadier soldiers, so mechanical engineers. 2 tanks are brought back to Australia, and they're experimented on. One of the rumours that came out was that the tanks had bulletproof lights. They didn't, and that's later conclusively proven. And it's because they're brought back to Australia for experimentation that one of them ends up in the War Memorials collection today, and that's that brightly coloured renovated tank that you see. That's one of the tanks from Milne Bay. But the critical thing is when you win a battle, you own the battlefield. So you get to keep everything that's left on the battle. The diaries, the nominal rolls, the tanks, the weapons. You get to exploit that for intelligent purposes. You get to understand your opposition, your enemy, in a way that you can't do when you're constantly withdrawing and retreating and you don't retain possession of the battlefield. That's one of the unsung stories of this battle, which is not only were the Japanese defeated, but the capture of equipment and records, prisoners. There's about 14 Japanese taken prisoner during this battle. The exploitation of the information that you can get from those prisoners, that you can get from the captured records, that you can get from the captured records, that tells you that your enemy is not a superman. They're not some unbeatable soldier. That helps you explain how they can be defeated. So that's one of the knock-on effects of the Battle of Milne Bay, is it provides the tangible evidence of weaknesses. Every army has them, in this case the Japanese Navy troops, but every force has them, and lets you exploit them for further battles. That's one of the great gifts to the Allied war effort from winning the Battle of Milne Bay, is securing all that equipment and that knowledge, which then explains how the Japanese can be defeated and can be used in the future battles. The Air Force cannot be praised highly enough in this operation. It's the Air Force that attacked Commander Tsukioka and stranded his force on Guinea Island. All 7 barges that he is using are sunk or set on fire. They cannot participate in the battle. They cannot attack over the mountains from the north and outflank the Australians. Next day, when the Japanese land, 2 days later, when the Air Force attacks the Japanese landing force at Milne Bay, 12 landing craft. All 12 landing craft are sunk or set afire. 7 2 days earlier, 12 that day, 19 for 19, pretty impressive score. That strands the Japanese force. In fact, the landing craft are so critically short that when the Japanese conduct the evacuation, they've only got 2 left to conduct the evacuation. I should say too that there was a lot of debate about whether the Air Force 75 and 76 Squadron aircraft should be withdrawn back to Port Moresby for their safety. And on one night they are. Louis Truscott, he doesn't go back to the planes, he stays at Milne Bay. I won't use the language that he used, but he said, no, I'm not going. That caused a dip in the Australian soldiers' morale. When those aircraft came back the next day, morale went through the roof. The Air Force decision to stick it out at Milne Bay and to provide close support to the Australian forces, the fact that they sank those barges, the fact that they could identify the Japanese landing force when it was coming in, that was, as acknowledged by General Cars himself, the decisive factor in this battle. And I should say, as you can see, there's some other Air Force units. The irony of this one is there were torpedoes. The Air Force had torpedoes at Milne Bay, but didn't have torpedo bombers. They arrived a day later. And that would have been very helpful because, had they been there earlier, because, find it, the naval presence in the region is small. Why? Because there isn't a lot of Navy, Australian Navy, Royal Australian Navy or US Navy in the area, and most of it has actually been siphoned off to go and fight over in the Solomons at Guadalcanal. That leaves 2 Australian destroyers, and they're quite small. And if you compare what the Japanese have available, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, lots of destroyers, this leaves the Australians with 2 destroyers to cover all of Papua New Guinea. They just simply cannot be risked against this larger Japanese force. So what you see of that pattern of Japanese naval landing forces ashore attacking at night, withdrawing to the jungle, the safety of the jungle during the the day, Australian aircraft attacking during the day. There's a handover of control of the battlefield. At the night, the Japanese are the ones moving. The day, the Australians are the ones moving. At night, the Japanese ships are actually coming into the bay and shelling Australian positions. Not effectively, but they are shelling Australian positions. I could offer a counterpoint to the war crimes that occurred against the captured Australians and against the local Papuans. One night, when the Japanese, or 2 nights in a row, the Japanese ships come into the bay, you can actually see an Australian hospital ship there. It's clearly marked, it's lit up in accordance with the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, and they decide not to shoot it. If they do shoot a supply ship, that's fair game under the rules of war, but for 2 nights in a row, the Japanese Navy do not fire a single shot against the sitting duck of a target of a hospital ship. That's really quite a contrast to the behaviour of the forces ashore. As you would have heard before, it's the role of the Coast Watchers which is really a key component. They're the ones who can provide information on ship movements which can then steer the Air Force in to conduct the strikes against those landing craft to the north in particular, that provide advance warning to the Australians and the Americans ashore of Japanese ship movements. That gives the Australians another decisive advantage. Lastly, I think I'll probably just might stop it here. This is taken from that post-battle report that the Japanese undertook of trying to understand why the conflict went the way that it, or battle went the way that it did. And this is actually showing the final night attack against number 3 airstrip. And this is the airstrip here. That's north. You would have noticed that in my map, the airstrip is not at this angle, it's at that angle. Because they were operating at night, because no one had reliable maps. Quite simply, the Japanese never really knew where they were. That is taken from the hand-drawn map, drawn by survivors, by interviewing a number of survivors immediately after the battle, and they've got the orientation of a 2-kilometre long, 70-metre wide airstrip out by 90 degrees. I'm not saying to make fun of people, I'm saying that that's what happens when you fight in the darkness, when you don't have good information about where you are. And it also tells you that no amount of torture is going to convince local Papuans to help you. Japanese land in the east, every time they go further west, they become less certain of where they are. Australians start out here in the west, every time they advance further east, their mapping gets less and less accurate, and they become less certain of where they are. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, look, thank you for putting up with